it's been too long. But then maybe it hasn't. Just what do you remember? Remember what? Well, I'm thinking about public school. I'm thinking about being in grade 1. And there I started to learn how to read and to write. Learned about numbers. But that's not what I'm thinking about right now. I'm thinking about the time when I learned about shapes. Mrs. Reed was our teacher for the first 4 years. And one day she had cutouts for us. One was a circle, one was a square, one was a triangle. And we were asked first of all to trace around the square and the circle and the triangle. And then we were asked to draw it freehand. And then she taught us a really important lesson. She said you can't put a square in a triangle, and you can't put a circle in a square, and so on. They just don't fit. And what do we say? You can't put a square peg in a round hole, right? Now, we got that settled. I want to talk about turtles. Maybe you've had a pet turtle, but you haven't had a pet turtle like the pet turtle I'm talking about and thinking about. My mother was a teacher in a school by Townsend Lake. It was a very sheltered place where I grew up, and there were certain animals and turtles that you don't see anymore. And they had captured one, and they had drilled a hole in its shell, and that's how they kept them. But when we drove that morning to take my mom to school, there was this turtle here. It was as big as a wash tub. And you know what I did? I rode in the back of that turtle. Do you believe me? Oh, some people do, some people don't. Well, I was also in Ontario Forest Technical School. I'm a resource technician. And there we learned about surveying and cruising timber and about plants. And also we had one professor with wildlife. And after one class I said to him, you know, turtles grew in Townsend Lake, biggest wash tub, and I rode in the back of one. And do you know what his response was? It was negative. He said, there's no way turtles grow that big in Ontario. But they do. I've talked to people who have seen them. So, why didn't that person believe that there were turtles that big? It's because of his worldview. He was just like me saying to him that you can put a square peg into a round hole. His idea was simply no turtles like that ever existed. You could show him pictures, you could put one in front of him, he'd say it came from someplace else. Or you could have other people tell him, they still wouldn't believe. And you may ask yourselves, why? Why am I bringing this up? What difference does it make in terms of our passage? Well, it makes a great deal of difference, because that's what Jesus is talking about. He's saying you can't put a square peg into a round hole. And if God doesn't change your worldview, how you see things, you're not going to have new life. He's talking about an old covenant and a new covenant, and he's saying you can't put the new covenant into the old covenant. It just doesn't work. I'm going to break this up into 3 parts, and the first part is this. Fasting, and then a patch, and then why. So, fasting. I assume that this week you fasted? No? You didn't? Oh, somebody did. Overnight, probably because you had to have blood drawn, right? But basically, unless you want a cleansing process or you feel you're too heavy, we don't fast. Fasting for us is something that we just don't do. But in the Near East, they did it all the time when Jesus was alive. They fasted and they prayed. And they had sackcloth. Sackcloth and the ashes they used to lie in. Can you imagine that? Not in our koshy society, we don't think in those respects. And so that's why we have the passage that we have. Jesus' disciples were not fasting and they weren't praying. And so some of the Pharisees came up to them and simply said, "Why don't your disciples fast and pray? John the Baptist's disciples do, the Pharisees do, so why don't you?" Jesus' response was this. He said, "When you're at a wedding feast, do you fast?" Anybody going to a wedding here this year? Okay. If you're going to a wedding, do you expect when you go to the wedding that you're going to fast? No. You're not going to fast. If you do, well, you're sure going to miss out on a few things. And Jesus was saying, I'm here. The reason you fast and you pray is for me to come close to you. But I'm here. You know, my disciples don't need to fast and they don't need to pray. Someday I'm going to leave and they will. And so he's simply saying that I come to bring in a new covenant, a new way of dealing with God, and you can't mix the old with the new. But he puts it in another way. A patch. Now, you were all sitting down when I came here, and so I couldn't see your clothes, whether you had a patch on them or not. But when I was a kid, a lot of people had patches on their clothes, myself included. If you tore pants, then you would put a patch on it. You wouldn't go out and buy a new one. And I learned how to sew patches on with my grandmother. For some reason, she should have taught perhaps my mother how to sew patches on pants, but she was doing it when she was married, and she had no idea how to sew a patch on a pair of pants. And so she taught her how. And my grandmother used to move from daughter to daughter. And so one day when she was gone, my mother had the hole in a pair of pants and she had to patch it. And so she did a really good job with the patch. But do you know what happened? She washed the pants and then they dried. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster because she put a new piece of cloth that hadn't been shrunk yet onto the old piece, and it tore away. It did more damage than good. And that's what Jesus is talking about. He's simply saying this. He's saying, who in their right mind would take a piece of cloth from a new garment and sew it on an old garment? Doesn't make sense, does it? Because you're going to ruin both the good garment and the old garment. So what's he saying here? He's saying, out with the old, in with the new. The old covenant is no longer relevant to life because I have come and I am establishing a new covenant. So what was the old covenant like? The old covenant was you look forward to Jesus. But Jesus is now here, and now we look back to Jesus in the new covenant. We know what Jesus has done. Now God dealt with the people in the old covenant, much as he does with us. He works in us and through us to bring us to himself. But now we have a better and new way. And so he's simply saying, you don't have the new way of doing things and try to put it back into the old way of doing things. Otherwise, what you're trying to do is to put a square peg into a round hole. It just doesn't work. So, he repeats it in a different way. Comes to the bubbly. It comes to wine. And one day I was visiting some members of the congregation, and we were having a pleasant visit. And all of a sudden, between, you have pauses once in a while, I heard this pop. I didn't pay much attention to it, wonder what it was. Then I heard pop up. Then I looked at the couple. And they had kind of a look in their faces like, this can't be happening now, we have the minister here. And so it went pop, pop, and then it went bang, bang, bang. And then they said to me, we have to go downstairs for a minute. I wonder why. They had put too much yeast or sugar or something in the wine, and it exploded. They confessed it to me. Well, in Jesus' day, they didn't have bottles for wine. Instead, they took an animal skin, turned it inside out, sewed it together, and then they put wine in it, and that's their container. Wouldn't the health department have a fit today? So Jesus was saying, now let's think about this. When you make wine, new wine, you put it into new wineskins. When you put it in new wineskins, they're flexible, and as the wine ferments, then it expands with the wine. The worst thing you could do is to have an old wineskin and put new wine in it, because when you put new wine in it, then the new wine expands. The wineskin doesn't. It destroys the wineskin and it destroys your wine. So you don't do such a thing. It would be ridiculous. So what's Jesus saying? He's saying simply that there's only one way to salvation, and that is through Him alone. He has come. He has lived a life of righteousness for us. He is obedient for us, in other words, and He on the cross was punished in full for our sins. So it's by grace alone that we're saved, because we ask Jesus to forgive us, to give us new life, and what He does is our sins are transferred to Christ, and He was punished in full for it, and we are forgiven, and then when we ask for new life, Christ's righteousness is credited to our account, so that when God sees us, we are right with Him and we become His children. It's by grace and grace alone. So why would we want to go back to the old ways of trying to gain our own salvation? I give this much money to the church, I go to church, I say my prayers, I read the scriptures, I do all these good works. You try to do it yourself, right? That's the old way. But it's by grace. You can't have grace and works together. Christ has already done it for you. If you try to put a new way, which is in Christ alone, and try to work your salvation, it's like putting a square peg into a round hole. You can't do it. And then he becomes quite sarcastic in our passage. Yeah, he doesn't become sarcastic. He He also has a good sense of humor, our Lord. And he said, no one who drinks old wine wants the new one. Why is that? It's simply because the older the wine gets, at least to a certain point, the better it gets. It has a better taste, a better texture, etc. So why did he say that? He was saying simply that the Pharisees and the scribes, and sometimes it's us as well, we like the old ways of doing things. We like to think that we gain our own salvation. And when we do that, it makes us feel good, and we pat ourselves on the shoulder, and we say, oh, what a wonderful person I am. Look, God sees me just as I am. I am very good. But that doesn't work. That's why God has to intervene. Remember, I showed you this? The converter? That's why what he has to do, he has to convert us, he has to open our eyes, and then we see where we are, and then we come to him. And we receive new life. That's what happened in John 4. Remember the woman in Samaria? She actually lived in Sychar. She had a life that was absolutely broken up, shattered. The reason she went at noon to draw water was because nobody respected her, nobody wanted to be around her. And so Jesus was sitting at the well, and he said, give me a drink. The whole conversation continued, and he said, if you knew who asked you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. And they discussed other things, and then Jesus said these words. He said, everyone who drinks of this water, he was referring to that physical water, Jacob's well, but he was referring more than that. He says, anyone who drinks of this water, that is the old ways of doing things, trying to gain your own salvation, will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water that I give him, but it's by grace, that